him up to rest. It actually isn't 4 o'clock yet, but then we look so official. And I think so many people came early for this very special afternoon, and I think we can actually begin a few seconds before 4. I just wanted to say that this is the third of a series we're doing this opening year of our new campus, and something called Clark Inspired, a series of 8 programs with different people and different perspectives communicating their engagement with the Clark and possibly how the Clark may have influenced their lives. And it's taken very different forms. It began with Rick Bertel, who is professor of art history at the University of Dallas, who's here today, who spoke on his many summers here and the many engagements he's had doing exhibitions. It will end in the middle of September with Kavita Singh, who is our consultant in sort of our global initiatives, and she's at the Nehru University in Delhi, and she'll be speaking with Patrick Flores, and together they helped do one of our international symposia, and that conversation will be about the Clark and its role in the world and outside of Williamstown. But today, it's a great pleasure to welcome people I've known in many different ways over many different years. But I'm going to try to do this in the most professional way possible and not tell anecdotes. But I would introduce it by saying, you know, why is the Clark talking about Williams undergraduate education? I really did want to look at art education over the course of the decades with this. But the reason why we can justifiably link into this story is that all of us in the cultural sphere within the Northern Berkshires owe our existence to Williams College, and we've all been part of a plan. I think the plan began in the 1820s when they took the library off to Amherst, and they've been working so hard ever since to show that something can happen here. And whether it's the theater festival that began in 1954, or indeed, in our case, Carl Weston and Lane Faison going to visit the Clarks in New York, and then encouraging Finney Baxter to bring the Clarks up here and reminding him that his grandfather had gone to Williams in the decade after the move to Amherst, class of 1831, and wouldn't he bring his museum here? And clearly MassMoCA has been part of a Williams idea as well. So we all owe our existence to Williams. We do many things with Williams. We have a joint program in art history here, a graduate program which graduated its first MA students in 1972. But it's in that context that we ask Rusty, Glenn, and Michael to join us here. And I'm going to apologize for reading some of their background and thereby avoiding anecdote. Rusty Powell graduated from Williams in 1966 with a BA in art history and European history. After serving as an officer in the U.S. Navy, he went to Harvard to receive his PhD in art history, where his dissertation was focused on the English influences in the art of Thomas Cole from 1801 to 1848, which is Thomas Cole's dates. He was a curator of the National Gallery for 4 years before becoming director of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art in 1980. And he served as director of the Los Angeles County Museum for 12 years before assuming the directorship of the National Gallery of Art. Glenn Lowry graduated from Williams in 1976 with a BA in art history. He will tell us that he was a pre-med student, but he moved into Islamic and Indian art as he decided to change paths. And he received his PhD from Harvard in 1981 with a dissertation on the tomb of the second Mughal emperor of India, Humayun. He became the first director of the Muscarella Museum of Art at the College of William and Mary. He was, and then a curator of Near Eastern art at the Freer-Sackler Galleries. He served as a director of the Art Gallery of Ontario for 5 years before becoming director of the Museum of Modern Art in 1995. Michael Govan graduated from Williams in 1985 with a BA in studio art. While at Williams, Michael was the acting curator of the Williams College Museum of Art and worked closely with Tom Krenz on the early conception of MassMoCA. He was enrolled in the University of California, San Diego when Tom offered him a job as deputy director at the Guggenheim, and in 1994 he was elected to be president and director of the Dia Foundation. In 2006 he became the CEO and director, and the CEO in Wallis, Annenberg, director of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Now that we've done that, we're going to hear a little more. It's going to be a little bit nicer as they talked with you about their years. And the goal is, in a few minutes, to give you a sense of what undergraduate life was like for people interested in art at Williams in your decades. And I will ask maybe a question or two. I really want to turn it over. You know, many people in my position say they're going to turn it over to the audience at a certain point, and then they never do. I really have a goal to do that. So let's see if we can operate under that basis. And we started early. So Rusty, what was it like in the mid-1960s? Wait, these are some people.
No? Yeah. Yes. Sorry. 1960s. We still wore ties to dinner. I don't think that much has changed at Williams over the years, although everything has changed at Williams over the years. I mean, in my case, my story is pretty simple. It was Lane Faison, who was, as most everyone here will know, kind of the guru of the Williams art history faculty, and he pretty much, in my case, I also started as a pre-mid, and I lasted about 3 months, and when chemistry went south, Lane Faison came north, and let me join the art history 101 program, and I'd never had it I went to a small prep school and I had no real background in art history, and Lane was pretty much that, and I was taken under Lane's wing, and all the way through undergraduate school, all the time during the Navy, and when I was ready to think about going to graduate school, I called him and asked him if he would write me a letter of recommendation, and he said he would only write me a letter of recommendation if I went on in art history, which is the only thing I was ever good at. So he was pretty much a mentor for me and so many others, undergraduates, and introduced me to art history, and I've been eternally grateful to that. Bill Pearson was another one who I worked very closely with, and of course Whit started, was part of the trio at the time.
Talk a bit about the trio, because how did they really operate? And were they friends?
No, they were very good friends. Whit Stoddard was less active when I was here then, so it tended to be Bill Pearson, and I was sort of more interested in American art and modern art than I was medieval art. So I studied mostly with them, with Lane, and Fred Rudolph in American history was also he was very interested in art and was part of that group. But they were very good friends. But they, I think justifiably ascended to the first rank of teaching. If I think of teaching, I think of them. That was what they were all about. They were devoted to it, and they were very patient with novice students who really were told that Art History 101 would be great if you played football, because they turned the lights out at noon and you could go to sleep. So it was a revelatory experience in a lot of ways. But Lane was, at least in my time, at least with what I did, he was pretty much the leader of the pack.
What was the magic with Lane? What was, because he could beat you up and you didn't mind? I mean, what was it? Was it about
I don't know. He was a beater-upper. He would
magic in the classroom.
He would ask relatively simple, extremely complex questions, like describe the color of brown, and I'd never thought about that, describing it before. He also, the museum wasn't as active as it is now in the developing programs for students doing exhibitions and things. So he mostly wrote everyone out of town. We were sent to artist studios and down to the Museum of Modern Art and to the Met and to every other place imaginable, Boston, to come back and write papers about it. So it was wonderful, and he would gently criticize. There was never anything very strident about it, and kind of nudge you into a direction that made you think you were leading, and he was extremely effective about that. He would also be very honest with you and tell you what, if he disagreed with something and why he did, which was in my case often.
He was enthusiastic about looking. Glenn, 11 years later, you graduated. What was it like for you?
Well, I've spent most of my life trying to catch up with Rusty. You know, he was 10 years ahead of me here, then 10 years ahead of me at Harvard, and you know, he's a pretty good role model to follow. And I just want to say, before talking a little bit about Williams, I think you've done a superb job here with the renovations and the new buildings, Michael. It's an utter triumph, and I hope you and everybody here really appreciates what you've achieved. Now, I came to Williams not having really thought about what I was going to do, other than with a kind of lurking notion that I had two goals in life as an undergraduate. One was to make the national ski team, and the other was to be a doctor. And pretty much by the end of my freshman year, both of those ideas had gone out the door, which precipitated the kind of typical undergraduate crisis of, oh my God, what do I do? And I ended up in art history really by accident. I had no idea that Williams had an art history department, or that it in fact had a series of legendary graduates. What happened to me was a faculty advisor who said, so you're panicked that you're not going to do pre-med? You're at a liberal arts college. The whole point is to take courses in subjects you've never thought about or don't know anything about. So I looked through the course catalog and reflected on why my first semester at Williams had been a disaster. And the first thing I understood was I really am not good early in the morning, so no morning classes. And the second thing that was very clear to me was there was a real difference between classes that met Monday, Wednesday, Friday, no weekends, or Tuesday, Thursday, really long weekends. So I combed through the course catalog, basically, looking for courses that met in the afternoon and met on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and up came a course on Indian and Islamic art taught by Milo Beach. And there were no computers then. You actually had to draw a little grid, kind of plug in each course. So I took the course and was seduced in a nanosecond. Milo, who some of you may remember, was an utterly brilliant, charismatic teacher. Somebody who could make what on the surface might seem arcane and esoteric material pop off the screen and come alive in a really visceral way. And I was very lucky because I also fell under the sway of Lane. Bill and Whit really were not very active by the time I was at Williams, but Lane was still very much in his game, director of the College Art Museum, teaching courses, and a kind of presence at all times. And he took me, like almost anybody else that he saw, under his wing. And I think what Lane did, at least for my generation and perhaps for others, was he made the profession of art history seem urgent and important. For someone who had grown up believing that you needed a profession, whether it was the law or medicine or business, Lane made art history feel immediate and urgent. And today I think we talk a little bit about art appreciation. I mean, that's really what Lane did. It wasn't kind of deep history. It was eliciting from the coterie of students that he engaged with this notion that you could talk about art and think about art, and it was a window into understanding the world. And so I began taking as many art history courses as I could find, because it was in fact true. They did turn down the lights. Usually it was in the afternoon, and you could doze off and still get through without too much trouble. But more importantly, there were at Williams in the 1970s a cohort of brilliant teachers, E.J. Johnson, Zirka Filipchuk, Milo Beach, Whit Stoddard, and others, who each one of whose courses was utterly captivating. And my journey was interesting in that I suddenly discovered not only that I loved the material and that by some miracle I was okay at it, but more importantly, I really liked the other students who were studying art history and studio art. They were really interesting, engaged, lively minds. And I do have a connection with the Clark, which is I didn't know what I was going to do when I graduated. In fact, I had absolutely no clue at all. But my senior year, I took a course in the art history program here at the Clark, taught by George Hamilton on Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. And it was riveting. And I remember particularly George's lectures on Cézanne, which made the paint on the surface of paintings become alive. And he had a way of describing Cézanne's process that was thrilling. And I thought, well, that's what I want to be able to do. I want to be able to think and look like that and be able to engage like that. And so that led me ultimately to graduate school.
Now, the Bouguereau story from age 5, which you have to tell, I mean, had no influence. First you tell the story, then tell you that it had no
Well,
influence.
when you look backwards, you realize that everything was preordained. I mean, so I'll tell two stories because they're the dots or the lines that link the dots. So when my parents moved to Williamstown, and I was about 6 years old, or at least I think I was 6 years old. My mother is constantly adjusting that, but I think I was 6 years old. They took us, my sister and I, to the Clark. Obviously, it was the great cultural institution in town, and we'd moved from New York. And somehow I got lost or wandered away from my parents and found myself wandering down a hall, and I saw the great Bouguereau with satyr and nymphs, and sat down in front of it and thought, oh my God, I have died and gone to heaven as a child. Okay, so that registered in the mind. The other thing that was true was that our next door neighbor for many years while I was growing up was George Hamilton. But in fact, we never talked about art. I mean, he almost got me kicked out of Pine Cobble because as a child, we had to write one of those papers on Shakespeare that every sixth grader probably has to write. And so I didn't know what to say, and my parents said, well, go talk to Mr. Hamilton. He'll know what to talk about. So I went to George and said, you know, I have to write this paper on Shakespeare. His son, Ricky, was in my class. And this is my vivid memory of George Hamilton. He said, well, the thing you need to know about Shakespeare is he didn't write any of his plays. Milton did. So I dutifully wrote that down, submitted a paper for which I was wildly criticized and saved only by, you know, Mr. Hamilton coming in at the 11th hour. So these things do connect, but in odd ways.
Thank you. Now we'll move to Michael, who was born in North Adams, but no, you had a life beyond the Northern Berkshires. Shortly after leaving.
It's true
the
confession. I was born in North Adams Hospital, which I guess is closed now, which is sad. So my father taught here. In fact, the O'Connors who are here are my godparents. So I have this history, I guess, here. And then I left soon after. My dad taught at Williams, and I don't know why I chose Williams. I remember visiting it and think it was too small, but it had wonderful resources. Came to Williams. And by the time I got to Williams, is art history was at 9 o'clock in the morning. So they'd figured that out, I guess. And E.J. Johnson taught Art 101. And I think the thing that was so fantastic about that was the sense of humor. And I knew Lane Faison. I wasn't there for Bill Pearson or the others, but the sense of humor that E.J. imparted to art history was something that kept you going at 9 in the morning in the dark room. And it was, I guess my story is, I came to be an artist, and the whole point was to take art history to steal ideas, not necessarily to study art history for the sake of it. But it has to do with the Clark, because I think the second semester of my freshman year, Michael Reinhardt was head of the library and was teaching a seminar on Michelangelo's drawings. And I had copied every single one of Michelangelo's drawings already. So I thought, wow, this would be great. And not knowing or thinking graduate course, non-graduate course, I just asked if I could get in. And I remember seeing him, and I guess since I had copied every Michelangelo drawing, I was let in the class. So I started my graduate art history courses here at the Clark in my freshman year. And that sort of slowly drew me into art history. And one of the beautiful things about the graduate program here is visiting professors. Lyndon Auckland was here. Obviously, George Hamilton taught here, which was so fantastic. And then I also got to take a course later with Charles Mitchell. My other love was Picasso, and I think that was my third year, and that ended up being work I did there was the subject of an exhibition I did at Williams College. But the Clark was what really got me into art history as well as the professors. And one of the most extraordinary things about the Clark for me is it's got one of the greatest art libraries in the world, but I think it is the greatest art library that's open stack, and a lot of the big libraries aren't. So as an artist, what you want to do is rifle through art history. You don't want to do it systematically. You want to be able to just walk down an aisle, pick out a book, and look at it. And the Clark Library is magical in that sense. And so I spent a lot of time looking out the window at Stonehill, walking up and down, and spending time in the library here. And I think that's what convinced me that in addition to art studio, I would take art history. And I said, well, what if I did a double major? I think Zerka, Filipchek, and then Milo Beach were there, and apparently that had never been done, the art history, art studio double major, and it was harder to do than you would think. In fact, there's a famous saying that's attributed to Barnett Newman that art history is to artists as ornithology is to birds. And it was a little like that. That you would think they're the same thing, but in academic circles, they're not necessarily. It helped that the new building was being, I think, built at that time. Tom Krenz had taken over as head of the museum by that time, and the idea that the faculty was all together made it a little bit easier. But it was it was a lot of fun to work between, I think, the range of all those professors. Ed Epping was head of the art department, and I met Tom Krenz, who was head of the museum, because I wanted to spend the summer to stay with my girlfriend in Williamstown, and I needed a job, so I walked into then President Chandler's office and asked for money for a job to do a brochure on the arts at Williams. As it seemed to me, the arts at Williams were beyond any other. I started to figure out that between dance and theater and art, at which point the faculty was very angry that I got the money to do that brochure and not them. But somehow, being outside of any department, I was able to do that. And that's how I met Tom Krenz. And I think that's how he invited me to work at the museum then.
Can I ask, I'm going to start with you, Michael, but then go to Rusty. There are many people that we could have on this podium, on this platform, who would represent later professions in the arts that aren't art museum directors, whether it's curators, boards of trustees, people, artists. There has been we have produced here in Williamstown an extraordinary variety of people engaged in the arts, and that commitment is absolutely real, and it goes on. There is, however, you all are museum directors, and you all have had very complicated lives professionally. I'd like to start with you, Michael, only by talking about Krenz. You move quickly from your engagement with objects and then the art history thing to beginning to manage and imagining larger scale institutions. And you've been doing that, frankly, ever since, but Tom got you involved in that. To what degree did that experience actually shape what kind of direction you may have gone in afterwards?
Well, I guess when I found work at the museum, and it was an exciting time, the new Charles Moore building was being built, and there was a lot of need for cheap student labor. It was this exciting combination, I guess, of the intellectual, the art history, and the pragmatic, the doing. And I think there is something self-selecting about people who do what we do, that you have to want to make things, to do things, to be involved in the pragmatics of the world. And I don't know, it seems like that's what separates the museum crowd a little bit from the academic crowd. And it's one of the reasons I think that having the museums here gives a wide range of opportunities for students here. I know the Clark's 2-year master's program is sometimes a springboard, not to be in academics, but to work in museums, as many people I think have. And it was just easy here. There were one of the biggest factors was also for me was the Mass MoCA project, was Tom Krenz and Joe Thompson, who was another graduate, were just thrown into this possibility of creating a museum out of a factory and doing something in the real world, in that sense of something that had economic impact, that was involved in politics and real people's lives and was outside the ivory tower. And I think that's a little bit of what is attractive about the field. It's involved in the real world.
I'd like to ask you, Rusty, in the articles that get written on your collective generations, there's often talk about activities on the sporting field and how that prepares you for the kind of problems you deal with with teams in large-scale bureaucratic organizations. Can you go back to those Williams undergraduate years and give us a sense of whether that's helped you in managing large-scale organizations as you have all your life?
Well, the so-called Williams Mafia, most of us were on the football team at that time in the 60s. And I have long maintained that was, being at Williams and doing that not-for-profit management is a contact sport.
As opposed to an oxymoron.
That's right. That's right. But I think the balance of that was great.
And you were on the football team, and
I was.
And who else was Jack? No, he
Jack Lane
did not play football.
He was on the ski team, but he, like Michael, decided to do other things. Though there were several of us, Jim Wood in the 60s generation. Kirk Varnado went on to be a great curator and teacher. Bob Buck was director of Brooklyn. There were a number of 60s types who were involved and did get involved in museums, but the odd thing is none of us really knew each other. It wasn't one of these collective, gosh, let's all go do museums, folks. We all sort of had a different path into it.
Any comment on that, Glenn?
Well, I mean,
preparation for the complication of running an art museum.
Yeah, I mean, it never occurred to me that I would end up working in a museum. When I was in graduate school, I thought about teaching and research, which is what I really enjoyed. And I matriculated at a time there were no jobs in my field. So out of panic, took a job at this little tiny museum at William and Mary, did that for a couple of years, and then became a curator at the Smithsonian, which I loved doing. And sort of 5 or 6 years later, realized that the questions that turned me on had moved from 16th century Persian painting to the way people engage with art. And I do think that one of the things that's interesting about working as a director, and maybe working in a museum in general, is you never do the same thing. It's a constant barrage of working with donors, working with curators, overlooking budgets, buying art, creating exhibitions, engaging with people. And I think if you have the kind of personality that enjoys what Carter Brown used to talk about as episodic thinking, you start one thing, move on to another, move on to a third, come back to the first, go to a fifth. If you can do that and enjoy it, then working in a museum is incredibly rewarding. And I know for me, the piece of the equation that helps me the most is about athletics. And it's simply that you learn very quickly when you do any kind of sport seriously. On any given day, somebody else is an awful lot better than you. And all you have to do is work really hard and wait your turn and just keep going at it and going at it. And working in a museum often can be like that. You know, on any given day, something's really going to go wrong. And it's going to be way outside your scope of knowledge and expertise. But if you focus on it and treat it seriously, you'll find a solution and you move on. And you know, you have the privilege of working, certainly at our 3 institutions, with men and women who are so extraordinarily talented that you're constantly learning from them. And if you enjoy that and you can harness that, it's an extraordinarily rewarding experience.
I'm going to actually turn this over to the audience sooner rather than planned. We've had a brief look at the decades. We probably haven't talked enough about the faculty and their qualities and how they may have affected you. We certainly have played with the issues of how this kind of background has helped you in your role, your complicated role of being directors of some of the largest institutions in the country. But I'm sure you have different kinds of questions. Mine might be rather parochial, because I'm their colleague and admirer, but many of you come from other places. So can we have the house lights on? There are some microphones. I'm going to really engage. This is a good auditorium for collective engagement. So get the house lights on and let's see some hands for different kinds of questions. Sig, are you really going to want to be first? It takes so long for that microphone. But you cannot stop Sig when he has a question, so let's go over there. Good.
I'll start with two so I don't disappoint you. First question is this. While you were at Williams, the student body was very homogeneous. Do you think that this had any influence on the quality of the education that you got? Because the point of view of the missing diversity student body was definitely prevalent. The second question I have is with reference to today, the commodification of art, and at the most expensive levels. Has this principle of commodification and not any attention paid to the piece itself, but rather to the money flowing from it, does this interact with your museums in any particular way, positive or negative?
Let me start that by saying these are two very good questions. They're two very different questions. We're going to start with the question of diversity at Williams, and then and now. And let's have a comment on that. Is that the case? All male?
Since I'm last man standing, I was at Williams before it was co-ed. And there was no diversity at Williams, particularly at the time, which I loved. But it was great. I needed that. I mean, it wasn't great. If it had been co-ed at the time I was here, I probably never would have graduated. But so I really can't speak to that. That was all happening in the 60s because they abolished fraternities. The social life at Williams changed very dramatically, and but I think right now museums is moving on, completely reflect the diversity of the country through its arts. But
as co-ed when you were both here.
Yeah, I mean, Williams was becoming more diverse by the time I was here, although there was a frustration about that, and I do remember a couple of times at like 11 p.m. or midnight driving to New York City, just needing to go someplace, especially if you were interested in art, and just soak in that quality, but luckily it wasn't far away. Obviously, Williams also had a very diverse intellectual perspective, and by the time I got there, the student body was changing quite a lot, and I think that trend continues in a very good way and needs to continue more.
I mean, my sense of Williams in the 70s was it had the narrowest possible student body you could imagine. I was either the first or the second class that was fully co-ed, and most of the women, maybe all of the women who were accepted into Williams were just like the men. There was no attempt, they were looking for female versions of the men who were here. But I think what your question asks misses the biggest and most important point. If the student body was relatively homogeneous, the faculty was not, and it was politically diverse, socially diverse, and my memories of Williams are about the faculty much more so than they are about students. And that was the privilege of being in the environment that Williams created then.
You know, Sig asked a very, very different question about the money in art, the commodification of the object. We have to recognize that people have been paying money for things since ancient times. So it's not a new idea, but the question I think comes from the thing that all of you deal with on a regular basis is money too involved now? It is involved in inappropriate ways. Anybody want to try that?
Oh, wise one.
It's money too involved. Things have gotten very expensive. Museums are pretty much out of this picture for the most part. We look at the markets and wonder where when it's going to stop. You have an instant situation. I was walking by, we have a wonderful Giacometti walking man at the National Gallery of Sculpture, and I was walking by it with one of our trustees the other day, and we were remarking, I said, 2 years ago that was worth probably $10 million, now it's 106 based on the recent auction. So it's crazy, but there certainly always seems to be an underbidder, and it's just a fact of life. There's a lot of money there. Mostly, you look at appraisals. You do this, Michael. If you look at the insurance appraisals, when you borrow works of art for what you think they were or should be, and then you see the values, and it's what the market is.
But ever it was thus, and I don't think it has a huge impact on what we do. The market's always out there. It goes up, it goes down. Suddenly, I remember as a relatively young person when the Met paid $1 million for Aristotle contemplating the bust of Homer. And it seemed like a shocking price. And now $1 million doesn't seem shocking. What we do is deal with the works of art themselves and the context in which they are seen and understood and appreciated. And maybe even the kind of frenzied market draws an even larger audience to our institutions because it creates a different kind of interest, but nonetheless an interest that we can subvert and seduce into thinking about art in maybe a more meaningful way. But I don't see it as pernicious or ultimately problematic.
Just to finish that question and ask Michael, do you worry? We know that museums can be either conscious or unconscious pawns in the whole art market process. Do you think hard as the former director of DIA and at LACMA about the ways in which your curatorial practice can affect the market and who you pick and how it might affect an artist's reputation and the object's value?
I don't know. I agree. I find museums appropriately isolated. I don't feel that it ever. Mostly, it actually turns around collectors and value of works and whether you're adding value to a collection by showing it in a museum when it may or may not be given to a museum. Could it be sold? And there's this sense of value added. I know there's a lot of stress around that, but museums are so big. In fact, there's this lack of understanding. So often people will come up to me and say, oh, the art market is raging, that thing sold for so much money, business must be great at the museum. And you have to explain, well, it's exactly the opposite for the museum. Insurance goes up, you can't buy art, and you're bypassed by the market. So the public doesn't quite understand that, and I think it does bring a little bit of a bigger audience sometimes, but I find that museums are extremely isolated from that, and most of our curators are self-selected because they aren't interested in the market side, and so you go through the Clark and it looks the same as when those paintings were worth just a mere $10 million.
Yeah, back in the old days.
Questions? Yeah, right here. Yeah. Good. Terry, could you?
Thank you. Is this on? Oh, you spoke a lot about the influence of the professors you had and how they brought you along. And I was wondering, from the professor's perspective, when they had a young art history student, what were the qualities that they saw in young art history students that they felt were needed to bring somebody along and be great as an art historian? What you can exclude yourselves in terms of the qualities that you have, but what were the qualities they were looking for when they would identify a student and mentor them?
That's an interesting one. You'll have to channel your professors and think about it's a possible question. It's a good question, a very, very hard one to answer. So answer with any degree of confidence. But any ideas?
Well, I can talk to Professor Faison, and I don't really know what he saw in a group of 60s students, but one of the things that he was most interested in is teaching you to see, and just the sort of opening up of a visual experience into art and cultures. And he would get terribly enthused about that, and his world was all about the object and putting you right in front of it and making you see. And he would teach these critical studies, and you'd have to write. It was awful. 3, 4 papers a week about what you saw, and it wasn't that such and such was made by Rembrandt in the 17th century. It was how did he make it? How did he interpret light, and what did he use to do it? And I think he got enthused about anybody who got interested in that, and art history was pretty much that for me. I think there was something about, he liked jocks too, and the fact that he could teach a few of us, I think he got really excited about that. But that was for him, was if you were interested and you showed sort of a naive interest, he really rise that. He was a great teacher, and I think it goes to the Williams experience that Mark Hopkins on the end of the log stuff, but there's a lot to that, and it was a lot for those teachers at that time.
Yeah, I mean, it was a rescue mission. I mean, it really was a rescue mission. These wayward youths who might otherwise find themselves in commerce or the law, he and Witt and all the other faculty, I think, saw it as, okay, can we subvert them? Can we rescue them from a boring life that they might otherwise lead? And what I would say, because I got to know Lane really well, I think what he looked for in students was curiosity. It didn't really matter whether you were going to become an art historian. In fact, some of the most interesting people that he taught never practiced art history. They did go into different professions. But he taught them a kind of, he caught their curiosity and taught them how to do something with it that was interesting. And to me, that's the thing that I think he was scanning for. Was it a curious mind or not?
Curiosity, and I think that looking closely at all the evidence. In fact, I know I spend a lot of time counseling parents that it's okay for their kids to study art history. There's this perception, and we're probably preaching to the converted here, there's this perception that there are no jobs or that's a ridiculous thing to do. In fact, there are a lot of jobs.
But it is a ridiculous thing to do.
It is a ridiculous thing, in a good way, right? In a good way.
That's what they think.
In fact, I know that law schools love art historians because there's the detective work aspect of looking at all the evidence. I don't know if Mariette Westerman is here, who's at the Mellon Foundation now, but I think there's a change in art history, that art history did go a little bit away from objects, that was that power of the objects, towards theory. I was brought up in the theory generation, and now there's a movement back. In fact, the Mellon Foundation has been leading that effort to bring that passion for the object back.
Yeah, and I think, just to bring this around to now, I think of Emmanuel White, who was a senior last year, and why we have spent a lot of time with him here at the Clark interning. He had the ability to speak, black football player who had the ability to speak to young audiences in ways that made it seem comfortable, and he was an artist. And so he could actually look hard and think hard because he was actually copying as you did, Michael. But Emmanuel now is on a Watkins Fellowship, and we continue to engage with him, hoping that he stays in the profession. So it's still around, and it's around with a different generation. But it is about, I think Rusty had it too. It's about visual curiosity, curiosity in general. But if you get visual curiosity and possibly even a sensibility of an artist, there's somebody actually to work with.
Would you describe how you determine which exhibits to show within your museums, to either bring in from outside or to develop within your institutions?
That's a good question. I'm going to ask one person.
You've got a few good ones on right now.
How do you make decisions about your exhibition program at MoMA? We'll just do it at MoMA, because there's probably parallels everywhere.
Our exhibition program at the museum is a bottom-up program. Ideas are surfaced by curators in the various departments about artists or issues that they're interested in pursuing. And they bring those ideas up to an exhibition committee, which is a pan-institutional committee of curators and some other people, where we talk about all the different exhibitions that are being proposed. Is this urgent? Is it interesting? Has it been done recently? Is this curator the right curator to do it? The whole range of questions you might ask about it. And out of those discussions, we tend to focus on a small number of exhibitions and say, okay, out of the 10 that we just heard about, maybe these 2 seem most interesting, and we ask those curators to further develop the idea into a full-blown proposal. And ultimately, a group of us, the 7 chief curators, the department heads, myself and 2 other people, sit down and compose the exhibition schedule. And what we are looking for isn't just a single exhibition. We're looking at how that exhibition will relate to all of the other exhibitions that will be on roughly at the same time. And will it help create an interesting season, a compelling season, an unexpected season? We rarely think about it, oddly, will it be popular? Will it draw a big audience? It's really much more internally focused. Will it fulfill our mission of wanting to have a diverse, complex, nuanced, and engaging program that we would hope others would find interesting?
I think that's a very good answer. I think everybody does a version of that.
Yeah, we do the same kind of development, bottom-up development, largely from the National Gallery's curatorial staff, and like we all do, we like to organize our own exhibitions and work with, well, the 3 of us all work together, not as part of a mafia, but because we all do interesting projects that we like to share from time to time.
I've got a microphone over here. Hello, hi. You've been yes, hi. You've been speaking a lot about your past and about this institution and your institutions, but we're dealing with a burgeoning world art scene, and obviously work being produced at many different levels of competency and relevancy, some of them very local, some of them broader. I'm wondering how you are addressing that phenomenon in your own institutions. I guess that's what I'm asking, if that's clear.
Michael?
Yeah, it is true. The world is changing fast, and as I always say, art's been around for 35,000 years plus. Museums have been around for a couple of hundred years, so one should not equate art and art history with museums. Museums are a frame, a vehicle, a structure to provide access. They will continue to change. They aren't that old relative to art, and as art and culture changes, we will need to change too if that instrument's going to be relevant. And one of the greatest changes in, I think, what's going on is this, whether it's globalism or localism, as you may want to define it, that there's a larger world involved. We have a much greater awareness of the creativity of a whole globe and also of the localities, that we have a tremendous sense, growing sense now, a nervous sense, I would say, that the word quality or the criteria that might have been listed for collecting pictures in Mr. Clark's day or others may not be quite right, given the totality of a changing world and different cultures' perspectives, and we must be inclusive. So, I mean, I can say personally, one of the most attractive things for me about moving from the contemporary art world and modern art world where I was to an encyclopedic museum, complicated word, where the museum which Rusty helped build, was the wide-ranging quality of all that art and all that history. And in the old days, that was a sort of exotic quality of all the world to come to a locality. And when I went to school, we wanted to tear down those museums because they seemed to be bastions of colonialism. But as I say, in a city like Los Angeles that speaks 200 languages, and where contemporary cultures are very different, they need some of that past. So I think one of the one of the interesting things is about how the past and the present interact in a world where identities coexist, different kinds of very strongly different cultural identities, different criteria for living, for quality, for aesthetics, and you almost need art, because art is the great embodiment of this multiculturalism of our world. And so I actually feel that museums' present role is stronger than ever in this new world, that the ability museums have to be multicultural, to engage artists of all kinds in different languages is really relevant to the present and to coexisting in an increasingly global world.
Can I just add that I don't think there's a museum that deals with the problem of the global better than LACMA. I think Michael has found a way not only to treat the diverse collections with a fairness and equality that they deserve, but found a way to engage contemporary artists from very different backgrounds and around the world with those collections. And in many ways, what he's doing in an encyclopedic museum is a model for what any of us should be thinking about, even in our more particular institutions.
Good answers. Zig, wait, just hold on, Zig, because let's see if there's somebody else who has a question. No one else has a question? Well, one over here.
I'm afraid this isn't as serious as some others, but we have a group of guys who are looking back at their Williams lives, and I graduated just before they started building the original Clark, so that the Soviets couldn't nuke the art collections. I think that was part of the argument. But I'm wondering, as you look around now, there was a very justified compliment on the great work that Michael and his team are doing, but is there a monumental tendency, and do you see any kind of Ando envy of monumental museum building?
Well, let me answer that first. First of all,
shouldn't you answer that?
I think
to Michael.
It's called the edifice complex.
Yeah. And I would say that the Clark, I'm going to be relatively serious here, but the Clark benefited from the appropriately ambitious expansion projects of the Los Angeles County Museum and MoMA and other places, probably the National Gallery. Roberta Smith is not here today, but she and others have had an anxiousness about scale in art museums, and we hear about it all the time. It seems to be a post-2008 drill. But I have to say that and we benefited because we're a very different kind of place. And we put most of it below grade. We're a little bit about contemplation, but we're still about building. But I would say the important thing that when she dwelled on the fact that everybody should be having a library like ours and should be showing their books publicly and be embracing the reality of scholarship and relationship. I think the Clark has a very special role in the world of arts, and we're embracing it here. But it's really about ideas in the visual arts that may exist out of museum context as well as in a museum context, and it may be a kind of generator of ideas, a greenhouse for ideas for things visual that may have a relationship to museums and may not. And I think it was a little unfair for her to claim that every museum director in the country ought to come here before they build. That's just nuts. I think the brilliance of my colleagues in what they're doing for their communities, the largest cities in the country, is something to be applauded. And I just wanted to say, if she could have taken your words, Michael, around what you're doing at LACMA and how you have reinforced that, Glenn, this is what museums ought to be doing, and more publics are going to museums. I mean, you look at the Louvre, you look at the Hermitage, you look at the National Gallery in London, the British Museum. More and more people are going. You have to prepare for that, and you have to, as you say, make museums a kind of visual forum for the many populations, both now and in the future, that are going to be part of it. So that's my comment. Do you have a comment?
Spot on.
Sorry.
You answered it very well, Michael, and I'm sure they would have said the same.
Well, I'm sure. Yeah, but I didn't want them to have to say it. It's the whole thing is sort of crazy. Yeah, over there.
Okay, here it comes. I don't need to step up, but from an education that sort of values objecthood and really focuses on the physicality of the object, what do you sort of make of the art world kind of moving in a digital direction for your museums and your programs?
Well, they're totally twinned. I mean, the idea that somehow the digital or virtual world divorces one from the physicality of the object isn't really the issue, because I think digital platforms provide an extraordinary way to enrich the possibility of what you can know about a work of art. And I think most of us have found ways of harnessing new technologies to encourage conversations about works of art, either on-site or off-site, but recognizing that that objects are so rich with their own histories, none of which can be explicated in a label or even a simple publication. But if you could hear the artist talking about his or her own work, or a great curator reminiscing about why he or she acquired a work, you can begin to create ever richer possibilities. And the fact that you can digitally reproduce a work of art reasonably well is no different than what it was like to be able to take a color slide of a work of art way back in the Neanderthal age of the 70s. And so I just see the digital or the virtual and the physical interacting in very complementary ways.
I agree with that. One of the things, most of us in this profession were very concerned that the digital and that whole frontier would diminish the relevance of an original work of art. And what has happened over time, is, to agree with Glenn completely, is that exactly the reverse has happened. You can download the National Gallery's website and reproduce one of our pictures absolutely perfectly, but what it tends to do is make you want to see the original work of art even more. And our audiences have continued, all of our audiences have continued to grow. So I think the harnessing of the digital, the internet, and all of the technology available is doing nothing other than push forward a greater interest in original works of art and people coming to museums to see them. I think it's been a terrific experience.
Yeah, I mean, even just exactly to go into those museums, to go into MoMA and have the augmentation of those works of art through living voices, through pictures, through music, multiple languages. It's such an amazing time for art history in that sense. One should also not forget that art is being produced in those media. So I always say, like there was the age of stone, and then there was the age of wood, and then there's canvas, and there will be, now there's media art. So we have to think that it is, if one looks at our time, steps back maybe from a few hundred years from now, it may be that the greatest objects, the greatest things we value from this time as artistic expression are those objects of media.
Good question. I'm going to, Sig, well, this man first and then Sig afterwards, okay? Yeah, right there. Bring the microphone to Mr. Paul.
I guess I'm curious about a Lane Faison question, because when I met him in the 90s, this was an old guy who was open for everything, the most radical art. And I think when you think about the evolution of the museums and the Clark and everything that's happening, what I'm curious about is in the 60s, when you were studying art and he brought art alive, at the same time, there were artists just doing radical stuff, a box in a gallery in New York. And I'm just wondering whether Lane was as open back then when he was teaching, whether there was a connection between the history and what was being done at the same time by young artists almost the same age as the students working.
That's a good question.
This is, to me, as the oldest person up here. Lane was right on top of all of that. When I said earlier that he would dispatch the students, I knew, more about pop art. I thought I was incredibly hip at the time, and what was going on, and then New York was the frontier. I'm sure it's diminished to some degree, but at least it's had it's globally moved beyond. But he was very active with that always. And in fact, one of the things that characterized him over my time is he never let his people go. He would write notes to me constantly about, did I see such a show in New York? Have I sent our curators here? Are we thinking about this? Lane was very much a presence way beyond my time at Williams. But yes, he followed that scene. What he would do is make us and help us get into artist studios. And at my time, George Rickey, David Smith, Robert Motherwell, he would send us down or over or out to visit artists, and that was incredibly meaningful to me.
Wait, we're going to have to wait. Can we run a... Zig's going to ask the question whether we let him or not.
12 years ago, I brought Tom Finkelpearl in as the director of the Queens Museum. Now, I have to find somebody else because he's become the Department of Cultural Affairs chief. What qualities would you say I should look for in a director of a museum?
Of any museum or the Queens Museum?
Well, we can do both.
Who wants to take that one on?
The Queens Museum?
Just any museum. What are the qualities for museum
Have
director?
You ever read, these are very amusing to me, you read search firm headhunters' descriptions of cultural executive officers. And by the time you think you need sort of a biblical grounding, you need some level of immortality, a vision. Vision statements are my favorite thing to read. Vision statements over what the future of whatever institution it is going to do. You need, I think, for an art museum, you need an art historian, and the rest of it will happen from there. The idea of business models and bringing in business people to run cultural institutions is, on paper, I think, pretty good, but I really think you need to get to your own mission statement, look at the mission statement, and change it or modify it or make sure that it's what you want. But for museums, art history is what they're all about, and that's really where it ought to start. Experience, of course, is a very useful thing, but I think that's the start. But or collect a series of these search firm executive positions, and just sort of pick from the great fundraisers, communicators, educators, scholars, ability to get along with boards of trustees that are complicated. I could give you after this an entire list of criteria, but I think fundamentally you need to look really at the baseline, and I think that gets us back to what Williams was all about, at least for those of us who went here.
It is true. Rusty's saying is interesting because there's been a push recently. Museums are very complex businesses, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of money management, complex employment structures, responsibilities are enormous. You're dealing with the whole world, so there are these descriptions that go on and on and on. You have to be able to get along with everyone, but there's a real push towards the business. However, it's interesting that almost every business pick for a museum head in the last 20 years has kind of failed, and which tells you that the business of museums is art. And unless you can have an insight, you can't cut the costs and be a good museum unless you know the art. And I think that is interesting that our field has continued to value that, and that's what works.
I think somewhat back to that.
We're back to that, and it kind of works. So I would say art.
Hi, great to see you guys all here on one spot. This is really worth the occasion. As a lot of you know, I spent a great deal of time with Lane over the last 15 years. And
this is Steve Hannock, the painter. Thank you. Okay,
Thanks,
so
Michael.
Everybody knows.
Thank you. And one of the things he always used to say, we'd be talking about art of one period or another, and he would say, you can't forget that all art is contemporary art. And it's a matter of just understanding the history, human history that was going on at the time a given work was created. So that's kind of going at it from the other way, where you understand an object and the people factor all falls into line. And I think of a time that we all went down to visit Glenn one day, Ed Schofield, Lane, and I, and we went down with Norm's limousine here, of course. Our neighbors here are all familiar with Norm's. And we went down there, and we pulled up right in front of the museum, and we get out of the car, and the driver gets ready to park the car, and Lane goes, "Where are you going?" And the guy goes, "Well, I'm going to park the car." "No, you're coming in here with us." And the guy goes, "Well, I got to park the car." And I found that there was a spot right across there. I said, "Just listen, you're not going to win this argument. Park the car and come on with us." And the guy parks the car, and Lane wasn't getting around that easily. This is just a couple of years ago. And this guy comes across the street, and he's shaking. He goes, "I've never been in an art museum before." I said, "Well, it's not going to hurt you, so." And long story short, it changed the guy's life. And the whole way back, Lane was telling stories about this or that. And of course, he turns around and yells at us, "Glenn was a hell of a skier." But I bring that up because I think one of the things that made Lane such an effective teacher while he was on the faculty and after he was on the faculty was the way that he embraced the entire human experience, not just the microscopic appreciation of art. And it was that, of course, that the appreciation of this experience that, of course, makes the best art.
Wow, thank you so much for that story, Steve. We may be reaching a moment where there's no any urgent questions out there. Okay, is there somebody who wants to make sure that they ask another question? Yep. Where's that?
The question is of accessibility, and as well, I just wanted to say that when I go to a museum, I just love that there's a docent or an instructor or a scholar that really makes the art come alive. I'm not a Williams person, but your museums, especially, I live in New York, and the museums that have those tours that give us the life of the artist, or that Picasso's into jazz or whatever it is, it speaks to what we're looking for, what I'm looking for from a museum. But Steve mentioned about accessibility. It does cost a lot of money to go to museums these days, and I'm wondering, if there is. You're probably in the middle of the boards and the financial aspect of it, but I really do hope that museums keep the prices affordable. The Met is thinking of, well, they're coming up with the concept of maybe charging people and not making it contribution. So I'm curious that there's the business side of it as well as the praise for how you do structure the tours and the education for just lay people like me.
So a question about education in the Art Museum on the one hand, and about admission fees on the other. Does anyone want to take either one of those?
Come down to Washington. The National Gallery is free.
We all paid for it, though. We paid for it.
We just want Rusty's subsidy from Congress.
We paid for it. It's not free.
And there's also an app for that.
Well, it is worth saying that museums have, in the last decades, become more and more and more accessible. I don't think there's a day that goes by without museums thinking about accessibility. Whether free admission is the only way to be accessible is a question. We have mixed MoMA charges, we charge, but we have only about half the people actually pay. This is kind of a misunderstood concept. I mean, people do pay to go to movies, they pay for other things, and the key thing for an institution is to have a diverse set of income streams, because when times get rough, certain income streams go away, you need others, and the fact that people help support a museum is really great. And almost every museum has free hours or ways to get in for free. So I'm not sure that that is the issue about accessibility, but I think that everyone who works at a museum today doesn't go through the day without thinking, how can we make this place more accessible to more people? One way is to have people talking about the art all the time and guiding them. Another is to make them feel comfortable being curious, because there are two aspects to art. One is to hear the beautiful stories around it. The other is to feel comfortable wandering and being curious, because you can increase your knowledge over time. When you walk through a park, you think how beautiful it is, and then you can learn the names of the trees and learn more about them. And I'm a big believer in just sort of trying to set up a comfortable situation for curiosity. But I think it is, I would say, a lot of our jobs now are, how do you make art accessible?
The mechanics of accessibility and engagement, which gets articulated in many different ways. Sometimes in building bigger museums. Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and Glenn, Michael, Rusty, it was a great pleasure and a great treat for all of us. And I just want to remind you that we're opening an extraordinary exhibition from the National Gallery of Art in Washington today called Make It New, and the members opening is as we speak. If you aren't invited to the members opening, you can be invited by paying a fee. So so go take your money and join us.